an academic, a diplomat, and a parliamentarian, but above all, a charismatic intellectual and a public figure in the broadest sense of the term. Professor Manohar Lal Sondhi was a unique figure in the political history of post-Nehruvian India and a very dear friend of His Holiness the Great 14th Dalai Lama. Professor M.L. Sondhi's association with Tibet dates to early 1960s when he founded the Tibet Swaraj Committee. He was the Indian nominator of His Holiness the Dalai Lama for the Nobel Peace Prize, and he was the one who introduced His Holiness the Dalai Lama to the late President of Czechoslovakia, Václav Havel. And he also organized His Holiness's first visit to Israel. To the end, Professor Manohar Lal Sondhi maintained an unfettered faith in the future of Tibet. Today, unfortunately, Professor M.L. Sondhi is not with us anymore. But we're blessed to have Madhuri Santanam Sondhi ji with us, the wife of late Professor M.L. Sondhi, who is also a long-time friend of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and the Tibetan people. Madhuri ji is devoted to remembering him and preserving his intellectual and political legacy, which remains very much relevant to India's future. Madhuri ji is the director of M.L. Sondhi Institute for Asia Pacific Affairs, a managing trustee of Professor M.L. Sondhi Memorial Trust. She was an editor and a columnist and a founding member of Tibet Swaraj Committee. She was the editor of newsletter Young Tibet and had presented evidence on Indian activities in support of Tibetan freedom at the session on Tibet of the Permanent People's Tribunal in Strasbourg. It is an honor for us, Madhuri ji, to be sitting right next to you today, having had this opportunity to interview you, and welcome to Tibettv.
Thank you very much.
So Madhuri ji, when you remember your first meeting with His Holiness the Dalai Lama and your husband, late Professor M.L. Sondhi's first meeting with His Holiness, what is your earliest memory of your meetings with him?
Yeah, well, that was an unforgettable meeting. We met him together. It was in 1962, in the last week of October. Now the Chinese had entered India on the 20th of October, and it was a few days after that His Holiness had come with a gift of gold dust to present to Jawaharlal Nehru. And so we asked for an appointment, we got it. So that was our first meeting, and of course it was when you first meet, he was young and luminous, and so we were quite carried away by the whole thing. And I remember his advice to us, because we were talking about this, that and the rest, and he said all Tibetan groups should come together. That was his, but I'm afraid we didn't follow that advice, because we were raring to do things on our own. So we would occasionally come together, but we did a lot of things under the banner of the Tibet Swaraj Committee. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that, yeah.
So, you know, how do you remember him, like, as a person? You know,
oh, he was
what
young.
struck you the most?
Oh, he was young, and you know, he laughs, as you know, a lot. Now that's the last thing you expect when you're going to meet a holy person, and here he was laughing away, and
that too a person whose people are going through so much pain and tragedy.
Exactly. I mean, his that is I think the most outstanding feature, because he's had to face so many terrible problems, and I can't see myself bearing up to it, and yet he's retained that's marvelous. If you want an advertisement for Buddhism, that's it, because it just shows you how years of meditation and contemplation and all that give you this extraordinary, and he had no animus against the Chinese either. That was another thing that struck us. He wasn't speaking angrily about them, but he was presenting the Tibetan problem, and so he was very happy that we had taken an interest in it.
Did he, sorry to interrupt you, did he speak English as good as he speaks then?
No.
How did you communicate?
he spoke a few words in English, but he had a translator at that time, so it was not a direct translation. So yeah, that was the difference. I think even later, he always kept a translator by his side, and I forget the expression, I used to know it in Tibetan. He would talk to us in English and suddenly he would say something to the other, so that you provide the correct word or the correct expression. So he always kept somebody by his side. But in those days he relied on him much more. Then we also heard him speak at Sapru House when he gave a talk there, and again it was through a translator.
you and your husband were among, the first people whom His Holiness the Dalai Lama met and interacted when he, it was 1962, just a couple of years
Yes.
after he has
Yes.
reached Indian soil. So, like all these years, more than 60 years of friendship, how has His Holiness's ideas and your interaction with him influenced your life?
Oh, I think the mere fact that he is there, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, with that fantastic personality, that itself, I mean, without even studying, the mere fact that he's there and that he's been through this extraordinary experience, losing of his country, his countrymen, himself. I mean, the mere fact that he's there smiling away, that itself is, one doesn't even know how much it has influenced one, but it gives you huge faith in human beings, in spirituality, in the truth of what he stands for, all that. Because I think, and sometimes one is not even aware of it, but if he were not there, one would have a totally different, I mean, it would very much affect one's view of the world. Yeah, I think it's a huge, what you call it, he's a kind of standing example of what he stands for, what he teaches. He's there to prove it in himself.
You very much know about the commitments of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He keeps on reiterating his 4 commitments of life, right? So, fourth commitment, he always say, is the revival of ancient Indian wisdom. How important or significant do you think that this 4th commitment of His Holiness the Dalai Lama is, and how relevant do you think it is in modern day context?
Absolutely, that was another thing that my husband used to discuss with him, and that it was most unfortunate the way he had to come to India, but if you see it in a larger context, it does signify the revival of Buddhism in India. He saw this whole return, as I said earlier, of His Holiness and the Tibetans to India as a reintegration of Buddhism into the whole family of Indian traditions. And so he was very keen, and I think he mentioned it to, what is the name of the first Prime Minister, so to speak, in exile? Samdong Rinpoche. They had gone together to a Buddhist conference in Vietnam, and when they were returning, my husband was telling him again and again, you must have an institute for the study of Buddhism. He said it to His Holiness also. So when something was set up, we of course were very happy. The world always needs a spiritual dimension, otherwise we get caught in just the material, dialectical materialism and this, that and the rest, which is necessary, but I think if we forget the spiritual dimension, then we lose a lot of value, complete value in life. So he's here to remind everybody, not only in India but all over the world, that, and I think it's been successful, very successful. So I think that's absolutely wonderful part of it. Yes.
So His Holiness is a firm believer of resolution of Sino-Tibetan conflict in his lifetime, and he says it should be done, and it could be done through what he calls as the middle way approach policy. It's a political approach that does not seek separation from China, right? Many believe that this is China's opportunity to resolve this conflict while His Holiness is alive.
Right.
And many people say that this is not possible because China will not be ready to submit to the fact that His Holiness is the only key to the resolution of this conflict, and that they will wait for His Holiness to pass away. How important do you think it is for China to take this opportunity while His Holiness is still alive and resolve this conflict?
Well, I think if they had wisdom, they would do it with His Holiness. Then they would earn the respect and the affection of many people who are Tibetans, inside and outside Tibet. If they do it with His Holiness, then He will give it a legitimacy. If they wait for him to pass and then, sort of force their way over it, all right, they may crush, because this has happened in history that you can crush a people, but it won't be the same. I think it would be much better for them to do it in a friendly way. They will get the cooperation of the Tibetans if they work it out with His Holiness. It will be much easier for them. They will not give up Tibet completely, but they can have a better relationship. So I personally, but you know, I'm not a, I don't know how they think, what they think.
That's true. So one of the disturbing development in China's policy towards Tibet today is their increased interference in the religious affairs, particularly in the field of reincarnation, the process of reincarnation of reincarnating Tibetan Buddhist leaders, including and most importantly that of His Holiness the Dalai Lamas. Yeah. In such scenario, how do you think we Tibetans, Tibet supporters and Buddhists all around the world can prepare themselves to tackle this challenge in the future?
Well, politically I can't say, because if they do that, and you know, if they want to just squash Tibet and flatten it out and get rid of their, you know, sort of, or they want to control Buddhism, which they want to do by having their own, like their own Panchen Lama, their own Dalai Lama and everything. So there will always be some toadies, there are always in every society who will go along with it, but I don't think, you can never have a vibrant Buddhism again under their control, you know. I'm not an expert in this area, but I suspect that what one can do in the meantime is to encourage Buddhism outside Tibet. His Holiness is outside, he can, and he's already doing a lot of that in India and around the world. And I think it may even reach China and Tibet and Asian countries. So maybe it's like when, this is my theory, that when Buddhism went to Tibet, it was because there'd been a kind of a movement against it in India. So Buddhism went to Tibet. Now it's being pushed out of Tibet, coming back to India. So spread it around here again and spread it around the world. And I think it's very much something that responds to contemporary needs. My husband was very intuitive about these things, and I don't immediately have it with me, but later on I would love to show you some of the ways he wrote about, and this was in 1962, in the early 60s, about this whole thing about the spread of Buddhism with the coming of His Holiness and all those ideas.
Talking about your late husband, Professor M.L. Sondhi ji, how does he used to remember his first interaction with His Holiness?
Well, he was not somebody who was given to remembering things. He was going on to the next one. Most overactive person. So after meeting His Holiness, he wanted to have something else. He wanted to have a meeting. He wanted this. He wanted that. He would think of, you know, Nobel prizes. He was always going on and on, always on and on. He was the very last thing he wrote before he passed, I should have kept it out, was something about the Tibetans and returning to Tibet. I mean, it was a constant with him, constant. And of course, but we had developed an interest in Tibet before we met him, so that was a permanent. And it was as much connected, it was as much a spiritual thing, as much as the rights of the Tibetans, also India's interests. It is useful for us to have an independent Tibetan power as our neighbor, and not an aggressive, nuclear armed China. So there were all these aspects to it. So, and then he just, I think he and His Holiness enjoyed each other. First of all, they both had a great sense of humor. My husband loved cracking jokes, so His Holiness loved laughing. So, you know, they used to get along very well.
So nowadays, recently, there are several individuals and organizations that are, calling on to the government of India to confer Bharat Ratna onto His Holiness the Dalai Lama. You and your husband had shared more than 6 decades of friendship with His Holiness. You know him very well. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my husband had been behind he had suggested that we work for the Nobel Prize for His Holiness, and he was in Oslo when the prize was given and all that. So Bharat Ratna certainly would be the very natural thing to do. I can't remember, but I have a feeling he did think about it, and definitely he would support it. I think it would be a wonderful gesture on the part of the Indians.
Madhuri ji, you know Tibet, you know His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and you know the Tibetan people very well. What would be your, message to the Tibetan people?
You know, I've never thought of myself as somebody giving messages to others. I would say that I think it's just wonderful the way the Tibetans have managed their lives after being thrown out of Tibet or having to run away from Tibet, and they have done wonders wherever they've gone. They've been, whether it's abroad, in Europe or in America or in India, and I can understand that being away from home so long, what you felt like when you first came out and what the problems that face you today are different. But I think the mere fact of your being Tibetans, of your standing for a particular way of life, a particular way of thought, approaches to, I mean, the statements that His Holiness issues about, nuclear power or about peace and all that. That's, I think, the contribution towards peace thinking is so important. You stand for a certain ideal, and that ideal, the world will perhaps never be totally like that, but you always need that ideal to strive towards. And I think that at least one can't have two opinions about that. That ideal is something that you stand for.
Madhuri ji, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for being a long-time supporter of the Tibetan people. It's an absolute honor to be here sitting with you and talking to you today.
Well, thank you so much. It's very kind of you to come in. And I wish you'd come 10 years earlier, you'd remembered more.
Better late than never. Thank you so much.
Better late than never. Thank you.